And when you come to the end, stop.
Does the world have to make sense? That's kind of the whole point of philosophy, religion, and science, isn't it? Figuring out why things happen, cause to effect, and the more we learn, the more we can order things into neat little boxes. We get a feel for how everything operates. Sun comes up and later goes down, fire is hot, water is wet, things fall down when you drop them, and if you do the exact same thing multiple times in a row, you expect to get the exact same result each time. But invariably, we find some way that breaks down. If you live very near the poles of the Earth, eventually the sun goes down for the winter and doesn't come back up again for months. Hot and cold, wet and dry are relative concepts. Do fish understand water as being wet? The flame of a candle is quite cool compared to the nuclear furnace inside the sun. And if you let slip the surly bonds of Earth, gravity ceases to behave as you expect it to. But we human beings are excellent at recognizing and adapting to patterns. I love this clip of an astronaut that went up to space for a year, then back on Earth lets go of a cup expecting it to remain in midair only for it to drop, and he is visibly confused when it is no longer where he left it. Learning all those convoluted rules and reasons is part of growing up. When we're children, nothing makes sense because everything is new, but as we learn the patterns, we become accustomed to them and settle into normalcy. But as we learn more about physics and math, we keep finding things that just don't gel with our human macroscopic reality. Chaos theory tells us that certain systems are just hard to predict. If I put a ball at the top of a hill, which way does it roll down? Naively, you might say it's random, because each time you put the ball at the top, it rolls down a different way. But you're not actually putting it in the exact same spot. The hill is called a chaotic system because it is very sensitive to starting conditions. If I were able to use a high-powered microscope and a very steady robotic arm to place the ball in exactly the same spot every single time and somehow control the weather to ensure the exact same temperature and the exact same speed and direction of the wind and make sure we're reading the exact same level of seismic activity, and on, then absolutely the ball would roll down the same way at the same speed every single time. But in practice, that's basically impossible, so to our human viewpoint, it seems random. Nevertheless, we comfort ourselves in understanding it because we know that were we able to measure starting conditions with extreme precision, we would still be able to predict the outcome. As Einstein famously said, God does not throw dice. Except Einstein was wrong! As Schrödinger and other quantum physicists proved, there seems to be a fundamental true randomness to the universe. If I take an electron, a quantum ball if you will, and I take it up to the top of a quantum hill, say the outer electron orbitals of an atom, then there is no way to predict with certainty what it will do next, even with exactly identical starting conditions. It might drop back down to one of many inner orbitals, emitting a photon in doing so. It might be caught by a passing positron and annihilate into pure energy, or it might be captured by a proton in the atom's nucleus, making the atom undergo a form of beta decay, turning into another element entirely. All we can do is measure the probabilities of a particular outcome happening, and over the course of many experiments bringing that electron to the top of the quantum hill over and over again, we expect the amounts of each of the outcomes to line up with our probabilities. But for a single event, we will never know for sure what exactly will happen. This can be uncomfortable for a lot of people. One of the main reasons why people turn to religion is because being able to say, God did it, allows us to recover an amount of control and sense. I am no longer one of those people, but again, we will save the religion discussion for Hunchback. Even those early quantum physicists found this uncomfortable. Schrödinger himself famously proposed a thought experiment of putting a cat in a sealed box with a canister of poison linked to a single radioactive atom. The exact point in time when the atom decays is random. While we can measure half-lives of large quantities of radioactive elements, the lifetime of an individual atom can never be predicted with certainty. In fact, if a quantum particle is not interacting with anything else, it actually inhabits all possible states it could be in, a phenomenon called superposition. So that radioactive atom will be existing as both decayed and not yet decayed, and thus the canister of poison will be both opened and unopened, and therefore that cat is both dead and alive, and you will never know which it is until you open that box. Now, this is merely a thought experiment intended to showcase the ridiculousness of quantum mechanics as related to our expectations of the macroscopic world. In reality, the canister would have to detect the state of the atom, therefore forcing the atom to be in a single state, and of course the ket itself is an observer, and as a macroscopic entity cannot possibly exist in a superposition of states. But the idea has remained one of the most compelling to come out of quantum mechanics, and is often used to introduce new physics undergrads to the more challenging concepts of the field. Even fields other than physics can get messy. There is still a lively debate over whether or not viruses count as being alive, and taxonomists quibble about how exactly to define a species, just like astronomers keep arguing about how to define a planet or even a star. Is a black hole a star? What about a brown dwarf? Does Australia count as a continent? Should we consider Europe to just be an extension of Asia? How many oceans are there? This has cropped up most recently and most heatedly with the quote-unquote debate about trans people. A lot of people grew up being taught that sex and gender are strictly definable categories with only two options each that always align with each other. Two X chromosomes makes you a girl, while an X and a Y makes you a boy. Except at least 1% of the world population is some form of intersex. And that may seem like a low number, but remember, with over 8 billion with a B living humans, that's about 80 million intersex people. That's more than the population of the United Kingdom. There are people with only a single X chromosome. There are XXY individuals. There are people with an X and a Y who were born with a fully functional vagina and clitoris. Sex in humans and in other animals is messy. Sex is a spectrum. And none of that has anything to do with how your brain views itself and how you perform your gender in public and in private. Because yes, gender is performative and gender is a social construct. The ideas of what is masculine and what is feminine differ pretty significantly between cultures in both geography and in time. Would you consider a Catholic monk who wears a robe to be a crossdresser?
Frodo's nose is long and he wears a truss.
Ha! Told you! Pay up!
Oh, dear.
All being trans means is that there is a mismatch between how you view your gender and how your body is shaped, or how a doctor decided to assign you when you were a baby, and there are too many instances to count of doctors fucking that up. All of this to say, trying to categorize the messiness of reality into neat little boxes can make it easier to think about the world, but it can cause very real harm to the people who don't fit so neatly in the boxes you impose upon them.
I have an excellent idea. Let's change the subject.
The books Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass and What Alice Found There are classics of English literature and some of the most famous books to have ever been written. Now, I want to preface the rest of this by saying I am relying very heavily on the wonderful annotated Alice as a source for most of the background information here. It has reams of notes compiled by Martin Gardner, and I cannot recommend it highly enough to anyone wanting a more thorough understanding of the Alice books. I would not deign to write a video essay purely on those books, as Mr. Gardner has done so far more thoroughly than I ever could. I will be doing my darndest to make sure anything I pull from his essays and footnotes I am putting into my own words, and to make sure that any opinion I give is either entirely my own or properly attributed. I don't particularly want to end up as the subject of an H. Bomber Guy video, hence my being fully transparent here. Let's get this out of the way. The author of those books, Charles Dodgson, who wrote under the pseudonym of Lewis Carroll, liked little girls. There remains debate whether he innocently preferred the company of children to jaded and cynical grown-ups, or if there was a sexual element there. But however you swing it, it's still kinda creepy and weird, especially since he liked taking nude photographs of said little girls. Now, unlike the implication from The Magicians with the combo C.S. Lewis/Carroll stand-in of Christopher Plover, there is no evidence that Carroll actually did anything inappropriate with his child friends, and almost universally those children remembered him fondly when they were adults. Nevertheless, it is a fact we must keep in mind as it colors what he has written. Whatever the reason, Carroll preferred interacting with children, specifically girls. He hated little boys, and there are a lot of subtle parts to the books that hint at his disappointment at the inevitability that those children will grow up and lose interest in him. This may have been why Alice is constantly changing size in the first book. There ought to be a book written about me, that there ought, and when I grow up I'll write one, but I'm grown up now, she added in a sorrowful tone. At least there's no room to grow up anymore here. But then, thought Alice, shall I never get any older than I am now? That'll be a comfort, one way, never to be an old woman, but then always to have lessons to learn. Oh, I shouldn't like that. The Alice of the books was based on one of Carol's child friends, his favorite, Alice Little. She looks nothing like that blonde-haired girl in John Tenniel's illustrations that have become the canonical look of the character, but the stories came from ones he told to Alice and her sisters when they went on boat rides together. Ms. Little led a rather fascinating life in her own right. She met Peter Llewellyn Davies, who is the namesake for Peter Pan, which is a sort of delightful coincidence. She also quite likely dated Prince Leopold, the youngest son of Queen Victoria, though both of their parents felt that a marriage between them was impossible given the difference in class, but they seem to have retained a mutual fondness given that each of them named one of their children after the other. There have been many interpretations of whom exactly Carol might have been satirizing with each of his characters, but the general consensus is that two of them represent the author himself. Apparently, Dodo was a nickname for Carol, as he had a bit of a stutter, leading him to say his actual last name as Dodgson. The other is the White Knight, who is one of the few characters across both books to show Alice any real kindness or respect, and seems rather despondent at the thought of having to leave Alice behind as she becomes a queen at the end of the chessboard, another nod to the young Miss Little growing up. It's not particularly subtle once you know what you're looking for. Also, both the White Knight and Carol were inventors, though while the White Knight never invents anything actually useful, the real-life Charles Dodgson had some rather interesting ideas, like a traveler's chessboard with holes to put the pegged pieces into, double-sided tape, and even an early concept of something like Scrabble. Perhaps one reason why the Alice books were so popular is because, unlike other children's media of the time, such as fairy tales and fables, Carol didn't offer up any sort of moral. Perrault's version of Cinderella literally ends with him stating two different morals of the story he just told. Meanwhile, in the first Wonderland book, Alice finds herself in an awkward conversation with the Duchess, one of several characters who didn't make it into the Disney film, who keeps proclaiming what moral should be taken away from the most innocuous of things. Alice understandably finds this insufferable and gets away from her as soon as she can. That's not to say these books have nothing to teach children, it's just that they're not preachy and in your face about such lessons.
For if one drinks much from a bottle marked poison, it's almost certain to disagree with one sooner or later.
Carol recognized that if you wanted to teach children, you had to entertain them. I could tell you my adventures beginning from this morning, said Alice a little timidly, but it's no use going back to yesterday because I was a different person then. Explain all that, said the Mock Turtle. No, the adventures first, said the Gryphon in an impatient tone. Explanations take such a dreadful time. That's not to say that Carol had nothing to say. At first glance, the books might seem to be a pure nonsense from start to finish.
Nothing?
Nothing whatever!
Nothing whatever!
That's very important!
But there's a reason why people keep trying to interpret them. The whole story reads like a political cartoon that you almost halfway understand the references to. Is the Queen of Hearts supposed to be Queen Victoria? Are the Talking Flowers meant to read as a satire of high society in 1800s Britain? Is the White Rabbit drugs? Don't worry about that last one. We'll get to it eventually. Just put a pin in that idea. The Wizard of Oz books underwent a similar level of critical over-analysis. The Yellow Brick Road is the gold standard, and the silver shoes represent adding in silver rather than going to fiat currency, yada yada. What makes those two stories similar is that both of them have very evocative imagery that hints at greater meaning, but that meaning is never actually explained in the text, leaving it open to interpretation. Then they all crowded around her once more, while the dodo solemnly presented the thimble, saying, "We beg your acceptance of this elegant thimble," and when it had finished this short speech, they all cheered. Alice thought the whole thing very absurd, but they all looked so grave that she did not dare laugh, and as she could not think of anything to say, she simply bowed and took the thimble, looking as solemn as she could. Now, there was still intent from Carol, such as with his author self-inserts of the Dodo and White Knight. The two books are full of in-jokes that would only make sense to others at Oxford at the time, or even to the little girls alone. However, you can read whatever you want into them, and many political cartoonists do. The books don't have to make sense in a singular, conclusive way. That's the whole point. This flexible interpretability has led scenes and characters from these books to be used in science. The Red Queen effect fact, describes having to work hard just to keep the status quo, much as the Red Queen and Alice have to sprint as fast as they can just to stay where they are. At one point, Alice is in a shop trying to look at what's on the shelf, but everything keeps shifting away to her peripheral vision, which evokes the idea of uncertainty in quantum mechanics, where you can't know both the position and speed of a particle with high precision. I'll follow it up to the very top shelf of all. It'll puzzle it to go through the ceiling, I expect. But even this plan failed. The thing went through the ceiling as quietly as possible, as if it were quite used to it. This is a rather concise description of the phenomenon of quantum tunneling, which is surprising given that the book predates quantum mechanics by a good 50 years. Dodgson was a professor at Oxford specializing in mathematics, and for all the whimsy and weirdness of his books, he was rather conservative about this subject. He believed that Euclid had gotten it right 2,000 years ago with geometry and conic sections and whatnot, and was very grumpy about things like negative and imaginary numbers. There are 2 instances in the books where negative numbers would solve a particular problem, but they are dismissed as being too silly. Speculation has been made that the 2 books are long-winded diatribes about the state of then modern mathematics, like the Mad Tea Party being a satire of quaternions, an extension of imaginary numbers to 4 axes, with the constant rotations around the table representing rotations in complex space.
Clink up, move down, clink up, move down.
The evidence for this is slim, but it's an interesting thought. Certainly it can't be argued that the imagery of Carroll's books has inspired many scientists. One must wonder if Schrödinger was thinking of another cat simultaneously present and absent when he conceived of his thought experiment. Alice had got so much into the way of expecting nothing but out-of-the-way things to happen that it seemed quite dull and stupid for life to go on in the common way. The books are full of inversions.
I had a world of my own. Everything would be nonsense. Nothing would be what it is, because everything would be what it isn't.
Particularly through the looking glass, which constantly brings up the idea of the asymmetry of mirror images.
And contrariwise, what it is, it wouldn't be. And what it wouldn't be, it would.
The Tweedle brothers are mirror images of each other, and Alice has to hold written texts up to mirrors in order to read them. In fact, there is quite a lot of playing with language. Wonderland inhabitants constantly switch around various oft-repeated phrases.
Don't just do something, stand there!
And the books are full of whimsical parodies of poems which would have been well known at the time, though nowadays Carroll's versions are far better remembered. But perhaps the strongest theme of these books is that of identity.
You? Who are you?
Alice spends much of the first book unsure of who she is due to the constant changes in size, and it's really when she figures out how to control her height, using the mushroom bits she gets from the caterpillar, that she becomes more confident and self-assured. Perhaps because of Carroll's preference for children, the books also focus heavily on the relationship between children and adults in adulthood. The world that adults are used to navigating is strange and unfamiliar to children who have to learn all the rules even when those rules don't make sense. The grown-ups she interacts with in Wonderland seem to be just making things up as they go along.
Rule 42. All persons more than a mile high must leave the court immediately.
I am not.
And both books end when Alice has finally had enough of their bullshit and refuses to play by their rules any longer.
Oh, yes, a very good moral, if you happen to be an oyster.
Given how evocative the imagery is in the books, it is small wonder that it has been adapted for film many, many times. The first major adaptation came from Paramount in 1933, and it sure does exist. While most adaptations pick either the rabbit hole or the looking glass as Alice's way of entering Wonderland, for some reason this one does both in quick succession. For its time, the special effects it uses were groundbreaking, but now just look awkward and off-putting, particularly the weird big puppet heads. However, the Disney version does seem to borrow some ideas from this one, particularly the successive doors getting smaller and smaller, which does not originate from the books. Highlights include some rampant animal abuse. For fuck's sake, don't hold a live flamingo like that. Somebody call PETA, Jesus. And Cary Grant hysterically sobbing from behind a papier-mâché cow head.
Once I was a real turtle. Oh dear.
Oh dear.
The main issue with this production, and perhaps why it isn't particularly fondly remembered, is that there isn't a strong through line.
I hate you. I hate cats.
Alice just kind of wanders between abridged versions of scenes from the book until the movie ends. Walt Disney, meanwhile, had been trying to make an adaptation of these books for literal decades. Some of the first work he did in animation was the Alice comedies, following a live-action girl dancing with cartoon characters animated in orbit around her. Then, a couple years after Paramount's adaptation, Disney made Mickey Through the Mirror, where the mouse takes Alice's place and Bunny hugs with some playing cards. Through the 30s and 40s, there were various attempts to make a feature-length adaptation of the books, but it wasn't until Mary Blair showed up that things really started to kick into gear. The resulting film is the most influenced by Blair out of any in the canon, with the surreal setting pairing quite well with her modernist sensibilities. That removal from realism also gave the animators more flexibility. With Cinderella, there had been a lot of reliance on live-action reference footage, almost to the point of rotoscoping. According to those who worked on that film, the only animator who had any fun with what they were doing was Ward Kimball, who got to animate Lucifer and wasn't tied to live-action reference.
I didn't have to work making those very careful drawings of Cinderella and some of the other animators had to work on. And it was pure comedy, the old cat-mouse relationship.
At the time, he and I were playing in our Dixieland band, the Firehouse 5+2, and they'd always introduce Ward as the one who had done the mice in the Cinderella, and everyone go, "Oh!" Then St. Frank, they did the stepmother. I said, we got to get another picture here, Ward. I can't take any more of this.
In Alice in Wonderland, while the titular character is largely based on reference footage shot of voice actress Catherine Beaumont, almost everything else is pure invention. Disney still shot live-action footage of a lot of the scenes, but the animators weren't required to match it as exactly as they'd had to for Cinderella. That live-action reference actually came in very handy. For the Mad Tea Party, the improvised lines the actors gave during the reference rehearsals ended up being funnier than any reads they gave during normal dubbing, and the audio from those recordings had to be painstakingly cleaned so that what you hear in the finished film is Ed Wynn and Jerry Colonna ad-libbing.
Sugar? Sugar, 2 spoons. Just 2 spoons, thank you, yes.
It's very simple. Now, 30 days have no. Well, an unbirthday, if you have a birthday, then you... She doesn't know what an unbirthday is.
And the world is certainly better for it. Both of those comic actors gave fantastic performances, which the animators very successfully matched. But it's Ed Wynn's take as the Mad Hatter that is perhaps the element of this film that has had the largest impact on popular culture.
Those are the things that upset me.
His very distinctive register and cadence is often imitated, including by Disney itself for King Candy and Wreck-It Ralph.
Ah! You wouldn't hit a guy with glasses, would you? You hit a guy with glasses. That's well played.
And more recently with Chuckles the Clown from the D&D live play Legends of Evantris.
The voice of the last person you killed tells you things about their life no one wants to know.
You know, I had chlamydia.
As had become the norm for the Disney studio by this point, their version of Alice in Wonderland has significant changes from the books. Where most other adaptations present the various scenes in more or less the same order as the original text, Disney and company shoveled things around to make things flow better as a film. As I mentioned in the Pinocchio video, given that book and film are different media, they require different things. When reading Alice's adventures, you have the luxury of being able to flip back and forth between pages, and you can reread something if it didn't make sense the first time. But in a film...
Never imagine yourself not to be otherwise than what it might appear to others that what you were or might have been wasn't otherwise than what you had been would have appeared to them to be otherwise.
I should understand that better if it were written down.
You and me both, Alice. So where other adaptations try to quote Carol verbatim as much as possible, the Disney version is a lot more paraphrasing and even just fully new lines. But even when direct quotes are used, they are often given to different characters, like the idea of in Birthdays, which is related by Humpty Dumpty in the book, is instead given to the Mad Hatter and March Hare.
A very, very birthday to you!
Part of that transition from book to film involved the creation of fully new characters, such as the door. In the book, Alice just puzzles out in her head what's going on with the doors and the key and the various edibles, but that's less engaging in a movie. So the door is given a face as well as half the lines. By giving Alice someone to actually talk to, the scene feels more like a witty repartee.
One good turn deserves another. What can I do for you?
keeping you more invested. The main thing that makes this particular adaptation succeed where others have faltered is that it has a very clear through line that keeps Alice moving. She's trying to catch the white rabbit. The book has her trying to reach a pretty garden, but other film adaptations often downplay or even just forget about that. The Paramount version feels almost listless as scenes change around Alice. It feels more dreamlike, but as you might know if you've ever listened to anyone else talk about a dream they had, that doesn't make for engaging viewing. In the Disney film, Alice is constantly asking if folks have seen the White Rabbit, and she catches glimpses of him here and there, spurring her onward. This gives the film forward momentum and a sense of purpose, even with all the nonsense happening. Another part of the adaptation is Alice herself. In the books, she's honestly kind of a little shit, constantly being rude or tactless to those around her, which gets her into trouble.
I hate you.
As part of the trend of Disney adaptationally smoothing their protagonists, Alice is much more polite here, but despite that, everyone else is still rude to her.
And did you notice her petals? What a peculiar color.
And no fragrance.
To me, this seems like a more accurate portrayal of growing up. Yes, children can be rude, but even when they try being polite and mannerly as they've been taught, adults are still rude and dismissive toward them. To the adults doing this, it might be because they see children as beneath them or not worth their time, but to children, it feels like a betrayal. They played by the rules, but they still lost. I remember as a child getting into an argument with an adult, and right when I was starting to win the argument, the adult would just say, "Stop arguing," and pretend like what I said didn't matter.
I'm smart, you're dumb. I'm big, you're little. I'm right, you're wrong. And there's nothing you can do about it.
In a similar vein, in the book, Alice will at times be called upon to
recite
some forgotten Victorian poem and fuck it up. And the Wonderlanders will be like, "Wow, you fucked up that poem, girl." In the film, she tries to say it correctly.
How doth the little busy bee improve each...
Stop! That is not spoken correctly.
And then the Wonderlanders will correct her with the nonsense version.
How doth the little crocodile improve his shining tail?
This has always made more sense to me. Wonderland is supposed to be inverted, the place of nonsense. Where direct quotes from Carol are most preserved is in the movie's songs.
Of shoes and ships and sealing wax, cabbages and kings.
And boy are there a lot of them. All told, there are some 15 or 16 songs in the film, depending on how you count them, the most of any entry in the canon. Some are only a couple lines long, but every single one of them is a banger. My personal favorite is Golden Afternoon.
You can learn a lot of things from the flowers.
But even some of the instrumental sections will get stuck in my head, like the March of the Card Soldiers. I think what I like best about the soundtrack of this film is that it's sung by real people. There's no auto-tuning or anything. Catherine Beaumont is just doing her best.
Cats and rabbits would reside in fancy little houses.
And there's even a part where she fails to hit a high note. It's endearing, charming, and I wish modern musicals would allow their singers to have fallible human voices rather than soulless computerized simulacra with perfect pitch.
I once adventure in the great white somewhere.
I suppose now is as good a time as any to discuss how the film tackles the topic of mental illness. It's often framed as undesirable,
But I don't want to go among mad people.
but it's also very vague and undefined, as it is in the books. Unlike with Winnie the Pooh, where we have the very obvious hyperactive Tigger, anxious Piglet, and depressed Eeyore, in Wonderland everyone is just quote-unquote mad, whatever that is supposed to imply. You'd be hard-pressed to diagnose any of these characters in specific, though of course plenty of people have tried. Instead of an actual portrayal of true mental illness, we have a diverse array of misfits and social outcasts whom society would rather pathologize than make room for. We see limited attention spans,
What rabbit?
general obliviousness,
Have you dry in no time now?
and sometimes just outright rudeness.
A common what?
To put it bluntly, a weed.
Some are sympathetic, others less so. Do any of these characters actually suffer from a diagnosable mental illness? Probably not, but the whole premise of Wonderland is that
Most everyone's mad here.
Here, sanity as we tend to view it is the weird thing. It's only very recently that as humans we have started trying to make space for what we now euphemistically call the neurodivergent. And often that has come down to not even any sort of actual difference in brain chemistry, but simply an unwillingness to conform.
No cooperation at all.
Apart from the screaming Queen of Hearts, none of these characters is a danger to themselves or others. They're just living their lives as best fits them. At no point does Alice have any sort of fear for her life until the very end. Is it madness for a child to want to spend a summer's day having fun rather than learning history? Is it madness to wander through the woods singing to yourself? Is it madness to spend eternity in an unceasing tea party, cursed to keep drinking from the same ever-dirtying cups in an endless spiral around a single table with the only break from your tedium the occasional visitor? Okay, maybe that last one is, but my point is that we really need to stop conflating difference and non-conformity with madness. Just because something is widely accepted as a cultural norm, that doesn't mean it's sane. I would rather hang out with the Mad Hatter than one of those rich etiquette snobs that uses scissors to eat grapes. And that's something that more modern adaptations of Alice in Wonderland have emphasized, focusing on the repressed and stifling nature of the society that Alice comes from, and having Wonderland teach her how to loosen up and live a little. Though I don't think I'll ever be able to forgive Tim Burton for this. Alright, quickfire round. The caucus race remains a searing indictment of the never-ending cycle of American elections.
No one ever loses and no one can ever win.
I like how the Tweedles duplicitously appeal to Alice's curiosity to get her to stay.
Why? What did happen to the oysters?
Oh, you wouldn't be interested.
But I am.
Oh, no, you're in much too much of a hurry.
In the book, they just kind of force her to listen to their poem. Apparently you're only supposed to eat oysters in months containing an R, so that's what this is referencing. In the original John Tenniel illustration of the caterpillar, there are two bits that look like a nose and chin that are actually legs. This has misinformed basically every film adaptation, including Disney's. He's supposed to have an actual caterpillar head, not a human face. And finally, a dormouse is actually a type of squirrel, not a mouse at all.
I know. It's a Cape rat.
Oh, and postscript. Like Cinderella, Alice in Wonderland already has lots of Lorcana cards. I honestly kind of like that all of Alice's cards so far are Dreamborn rather than Storyborn. Very fitting. But thus far we've had no locations. Where is the Tulgey Wood, the Flower Garden, the Hedge Maze? I want to actually send Alice down the rabbit hole. Yes, I know it's an action, technically, but y'all know what I mean. Or you would if you played the game. Do any of you actually play Lorcana, or is it just me? Regardless, the turning point of the film comes when Alice has finally had enough of the nonsense as she realizes she is now lost in Wonderland. She no longer cares about following the White Rabbit and just wants to go home. The most tragic part is when she finally finds a path that she thinks will lead her there and a fucking broom dog comes along and erases it. Just like boomers pulling the ladder up after them with Reaganomics after they got their cheap houses and cushy pensions. The nonsense, which was at first delighting and charming, has lost its novelty and becomes more and more just a non sequitur, a background noise that becomes all the easier to just tune out. Alice no longer really reacts to it, and as she sits down and sings how
I give myself very good advice,
the nonsense begins to fade away, leaving her alone with my favorite character in this entire film, the Cheshire Cat. Voiced by Sterling Holloway, who, funnily enough, played a minor character in the Paramount version, the Frog Footman.
I shall sit here till tomorrow.
The Cheshire Cat is perhaps the most iconic piece of imagery to come out of either the book or the movie.
Can you stand on your head?
Just the way he seamlessly goes from lazy drawl,
Then it really doesn't matter which way you go,
to demented cackle is simply perfect. He is the avatar of the madness that is Wonderland. You're not sure whether he's affecting insanity or if he really does have a few screws loose. Either way, at Alice's lowest point, the Cheshire Cat appears to her and offers to finally help her get home.
I prefer the short cut.
Oh!
Of course, nothing can be that easy, and the path home must go through the court of the Queen of Hearts, our villain of the piece, who doesn't show up until it's almost over. However, she still has an outsized impact on the film, and she ensures the ending is a really good one. Her film iteration, voiced by the wonderful Verna Felton, is an amalgamation of the books' Queen of Hearts and Red Chess Queen, getting quotes from both of them.
Look up, speak nicely, and don't twiddle your fingers!
She's the ultimate example of the nonsense of adulthood, refusing to listen to what Alice is saying.
Your way, always here are my ways!
There are plenty of Karens in the world for whom this is barely a satire.
And always say, yes, your majesty!
The Queen ends up being more frightening than her literary counterparts, oscillating between almost sickly sweetness
Do you play croquet?
to a jet engine's volume of rage.
Ah! Flip their heads!
Adding to that is that in the book, it's made clear that the king always pardons her victims behind her back, so no one actually gets executed, but there is no such reassurance in the film, either explicit or implied.
If I lose my temper, you lose your head. Understand?
The king himself is quite a bit smaller than in the books, where he seems to have an equal standing to his female counterpart. In the film, it's all her, and I love the eye roll and exasperation of the White Rabbit's voice whenever he says,
And a king.
This might be a commentary on henpecked husbands, or maybe an allusion to Queen Victoria overshadowing Prince Albert, but in a modern lens, at least to me, it reads more like a twinkish wife guy who can't help simping for his muscle mommy, much to the annoyance of everyone else around him. The final major adaptational difference in the film is the trial, which rather than following the nursery rhyme of the Knave of Hearts stealing tarts, is instead for Alice herself, after she's blamed for the Queen of Hearts getting pantsed by the Cheshire Cat during the croquet game. I almost cannot believe that is a sentence I just typed and uttered out loud. At any rate, making the trial center on Alice gives the film more stakes at the finish line. Rather than her being a bystander, she is the focus of attention, and it's her head on the line if this doesn't go well. When it inevitably doesn't, she finally remembers the height-changing mushrooms in her pockets, and all hell breaks loose. I love this final chase through Wonderland. We revisit previous scenes and characters as everything breaks down, and the score is just fantastic. Also, I'm pretty sure this is the first instance in film of the Scooby-Doo hallway run. As she returns to the talking door that first permitted her entrance to Wonderland, she realizes she's asleep and has been dreaming this entire time, and exhorts herself to waken. Now, the whole "it was only a dream" thing is usually viewed as a lazy trope in writing, but I think it's perfectly fine here, given the nonsensical nature of the entire film. For Alice in Wonderland, it's not about the destination, but the journey, and whether from Carol directly or filtered through Disney's lens, it is a wonderful one.
Oh, for goodness sake. Alice, Oh, well. Come along, it's time for tea.
However, despite being the first Disney film to be advertised on television, Alice in Wonderland was a financial failure on its initial release, not even making back its budget of $3 million. As is usually the case when this happens, a lot of finger-pointing went down. Walt decided that the film lacked heart, whatever the fuck that means, while others in production felt that there had been too many cooks in the kitchen with 3 directors and 13 credited writers. In addition, critics at the time felt it had deviated too much from the source material. While Disney had adapted books before, this was the first time they had tackled one with a large and vocal fan base. Certainly Pinocchio and Bambi and even The Wind in the Willows didn't have multiple worldwide fan clubs and fan magazines and libraries full of literary analysis. And as we'll see again with Hunchback, those vocal fans get real pissy if you don't adapt their precious book as literally as possible. God, I hate such fuckers, and that includes you, Stephen King. The Shining is a masterwork of film, even if it isn't a word-for-word retelling of your little novel. British critics felt that the film was too Americanized, despite half the voice cast being British, including Alice herself, which is more than can be said for Paramount's attempt. Looking back on this film now, I see nothing but a masterpiece. The Disney studio studio did nothing wrong in making this film, and they had no reason to second guess what they did. My guess is this is simply one of the many times Disney failed to market their movie properly. My evidence? Well, 20 years after its original release, and once Walt was safely 6 feet under, the Disney studio sent it back out to theaters, but this time with some conspicuously different posters. Remember that pin? Yeah, let's examine that again. The 60s and 70s were a time of cultural experimentation in the United States, with the Civil Rights Acts passing, men landing on the moon, and Roe v. Wade becoming law. Folks were abandoning the rigid social values of the 50s, and part of that was trying all those fun drugs they'd been told were so bad. Marijuana, LSD, magic mushrooms, take your pick. And if Disney happened to make the poster for their surreal film that has often been compared to a drug trip, similar to the other psychedelic art of the time, why, can we blame them? Companies gotta make money, after all. It's totally just a coincidence, officer. How fast was I going exactly? With that re-release, Alice in Wonderland finally became a financial success, and it has been treated as one of the core classics of the canon ever since. Alice in Wonderland is one of my comfort films. I could honestly watch it every day. It is my favorite of the restoration and easily in my top 5 for the canon as a whole. Like The Three Caballeros, it is not afraid to be weird, but here the weirdness has direction and purpose and isn't based largely around the libido of a duck with a speech impediment. If pressed, I could probably recite this movie from memory, and every single minute of the soundtrack is indelibly etched in my brain. I don't know if I would have said the same had I read Carol's books before seeing Disney's film, but the two occupy their places of distinct pride in my esteem. The texts have a rich depth of wordplay and some very interesting ideas to ponder, but the movie strings it all into one cohesive narrative and has produced what is still the best imagery ever associated with Wonderland.
That's the most important piece of evidence we've heard yet. Write that down!
To me, what makes the least sense is why audiences in the 50s didn't like this film.
Why is a raven like a writing desk?
Was it really because it was too different from the books? This movie is simply a joy to watch, effortlessly funny with some of the most interesting animation ever put to film. True, it isn't the most faithful adaptation, and if you're looking for one that adheres much more closely to the books, I highly recommend the 1999 made-for-TV version from Hallmark.
I thought you wanted to go in.
I've been in, now I'm coming out.
Life is so complicated.
But as I've made clear a few times now, I'm less interested in faithful adaptations than I am in good pieces of media.
Try it again on soprano sax.
And Disney's Alice in Wonderland very much is one, despite its tepid reception back in 1951. Perhaps we need to do as Alice did and finally accept that not everything will make sense. Not everything will have an explanation. Not everything will fit neatly into sharply defined categories, and that's okay. Life is messy. Life is a nonsense, and all we can do is our best. And if that's not satisfying, believe me, I'm right there with you. All of my college degrees are in physics, and no one enters that field without a deep and insatiable desire to understand how the universe works. But in the disciplines that purport to have explanations, science, philosophy, and especially religion, there is a tendency to claim to have the answers for everything. And that does far more harm than good. When all you know about sex and gender is the simplistic answer you got in third grade about chromosome pairs, and you arrogantly assume that's all there is to say on the subject, you cause harm to those people who do not fit into the binary you are trying to enforce. When you're faced with something that doesn't conform with what you already know, something confusing or uncomfortable, something different, it's okay to admit that you don't understand what's going on. When someone asks you a question you don't know the answer to, it's okay to say that you don't know. Ignorance is only a sin if you wallow in it willingly, refusing to learn anything new. The Queen of Hearts adamantly refuses to hear any opinion other than her own, convinced of her own superiority, and willing to kill whomever disagrees with her. She is the villain! She represents what not to do. We need to be more like Alice, driven by our curiosity, fascinated by the strange, our eyes and minds open to the wonderland we live in. It can be scary, standing at the precipice of the unknown, but if you never fall down the rabbit hole, you'll never know why that Cheshire Cat grins.
And the more eyes out of breath.
Now, as I can see from my video analytics, there is a sharp drop-off in viewers as soon as I mention Patreon. But hold on, wait, don't click away just yet. I have a proposition for you all. I want to make it worth your while. No, not an OnlyFans, you'll get no feet pics from me. What I am offering is this. If you help me meet certain thresholds of concurrent paid Patreon subscribers, I will make certain interesting videos. Music videos. If I reach 100 patrons, I will make a video of myself singing Say It With a Slap from Bongo, so you can all see what an awful song it is. If I reach 200 patrons, I will sing the Yodel song from Home on the Range. God, fuck, why am I agreeing to do this, Jesus? If I reach 500 patrons, I will sing each and every part of The Whale Who Wanted to Sing at the Met just like Nelson Eddy. Yes, I can do it. I have the range, and my falsetto sounds better than his. If I reach 1,000 patrons, I will arrange and perform an a cappella rendition of The Sorcerer's Apprentice by Paul Dukas as featured in Fantasia. If you want to see these videos, well, you know what to do. As ever, I am grateful to Elijah Black and Eric Wagner and all my other Patreon patrons. This content is funded by viewers like you. It's only $5 a month or $10 if you'd like me to give you a shout out at the end of my videos here. Either way, join me next time as we pursue youth with Peter Pan.